Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to our Eastern friends that have joined us today. I named this session Eyes Wide Shut simply because so many companies in the transportation sector fall under hours of service regulations, and a lot of them are actually treating that as their fatigue management plan. And I'm here to tell you that that's not a fatigue management plan. And there's, while the hours of service regulations have come in with good intentions, they're a little bit lacking in terms of being up to date with current fatigue science, and they certainly don't account for time of day factors. So it also doesn't do anything to prevent somebody from showing up tired at your workplace. Who hasn't had a crying child that woke them up in the middle of the night and disturbed their sleep? So we cannot rely on hours of service regulations to be our program. We need to do a little bit more than that. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about fatigue management, but I want to start off with talking about how much sleep we actually need. And this is very important for all adults, and it doesn't matter what age you are, we do have a minimum requirement. And that requirement is somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep every 24 hours. What that means is all adults require at least 7 hours of sleep to fully repair the brain and the body from the day's activities. Okay, every 24 hours. Now I'm saying every 24 hours because we have a lot of situations where someone could work and maybe drive for up to 13 hours, maybe be awake even for 14 hours while they're on duty, and then off, but then they'll come right back to work. So that would be only 22 hours before they're now returning to work. So they're not actually getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep within that 24-hour period. We are not a 7-day species. We are not a 3-month species. We are not a 3-day species. We are a 24-hour species. And that means, regardless of what schedule we work, we have to stay in sync with our planet of 24 hours. And that means we require every day that minimum 7 to 9 hours. Now, as we get older, and when I say older, we're probably talking around the 60 plus age range, that ratio drops 7 to 8 hours. And the reason that we don't need 9 hours is more to the effect that we're not as active as we are when we're younger. But we all still need that same minimum amount of 7 consecutive hours, okay, one block of sleep. Now, the problem that we have with that, of course, is that we have professional drivers who are operating on erratic schedules or who are trying to sleep during daytime hours. So now we're impacting both quantity and quality of sleep. And we know that people on those types of schedules are averaging 2 hours less than people that work the traditional daytime schedules. So, what are we doing when we're on these schedules? How are we trying to cope? Well, a lot of people are reaching for things like caffeine. So, here's the thing about this. Uh, Caffeine is not going to help you with fatigue. Okay, you cannot Red Bull fatigue away, you cannot Starbucks it away, you cannot Tim Horton it away. All right. When it comes to fatigue, fatigue is based on the principle that we have fatigue related chemicals. We actually have toxic waste that is building up in our brain. That's what fatigue is. It's a biological state. And the only thing that gets that toxic waste out of our brain is sleep. Caffeine will not do that. What caffeine does is it will help you when you're going through a drowsy period. Drowsiness is not the same as fatigue. Drowsiness fluctuates throughout the day. And yes, having a cup of coffee may delay you from feeling the effects of fatigue, but it is not eliminating the fatigue that has built up in your brain. Only sleep will get rid of that. So let's talk about that sleep and why it's so important. So what I'm showing you here is a typical young, healthy adult sleep pattern, and this is based on a person who works during daytime hours and typically sleeps at nighttime. So here's the kind of pattern that we would love to see. And I want to explain what we're looking at here. So across the bottom, you're going to see if we were sleeping for 8 hours, here's the pattern, the general pattern that we try to see. So you're in the awake state when you go to bed and you first put your head on the pillow and you close your eyes. You're going into stage one of light sleep. Stage one and stage two are both considered light sleep period. It's that period where our brain waves slow down and things like our muscles are told to relax, our kidneys are told to shut down, our stomach lining doesn't have the protective coating anymore because you're not supposed to be eating at night. And it's really preparing you for this transition into unconsciousness. You do a lot of snoring in the light stages. And then after that, you're going to drop down into what we call the deep recuperative state, the quality sleep of delta. So deep, D for delta, D for deep. Okay. So delta waves, they're long, slow brain waves. And during this phase, two critical things are happening. First, it's the only time that the human growth hormone is released in the body. That human growth hormone is responsible for all of the physical repair of the tissues in the body. And that includes your musculoskeletal system, it includes your organs, it includes your skin, your eyes, it includes your immune system. So very important that we get good delta sleep because it helps to prevent things like colds and viruses. And in this age of COVID, that's even more important. So delta sleep is very important because it focuses on the physical repair of our body. But here's what happens when we sleep. As we continue through going in and out of these different stages, we start to shift and we leave a lot of the delta sleep behind and we transition into REM sleep for the last half of our sleep cycle. Now, REM sleep is important because this is the mental and emotional repair state. This is when cognitively we recharge our reaction times, we have our reasoning and our logic, and we're able to assess situational hazards around us. So it's a very critical stage from a cognitive perspective, but it's also very important to replenish our emotional tolerances. We know that people that are tired when there are more road rage incidents, for example. So we have to be really cognizant of the fact that we need to go through a certain amount of sleep, but we also need to get to the different stages of sleep. If we cut our sleep short, we're definitely going to be having some impact on cutting out REM sleep, which is that emotional and cognitive repair state, which is why a lot of professional drivers actually have very high divorce rates simply because they're not very pleasant people to be around because emotionally they're on edge, they're not as easy to communicate with, they're cranky miserable people sometimes, and it's all because they don't get enough REM sleep. Now, one little thing I want to point out here, this little blip, that's a waking episode. And usually we'll have several little waking episodes throughout the night that we won't even notice. And it's usually when we're just turning over in bed. Now, I mentioned this is a healthy adult sleep pattern for younger adults, for the most part, young to mid adults, but we go through a transition when we get older. So the older adult sleep pattern, what you're going to see here is first off, there's your delta sleep at the bottom. They're not as broad, they're not as long, they don't last as long. We don't get as much delta sleep. We lose about 50% of that delta sleep by the time we reach the age of 60. And then we also have a change in REM sleep. We don't have as many REM episodes as we did when we were younger. But what's worse than all of that is that we have a lot more waking episodes. And not only do we have more waking episodes, but they're longer in nature, which means that when you do wake up, you don't just fall right back asleep. You actually stay awake for longer periods of time. So you may spend 8 hours in bed, but you're only getting 6 hours of sleep. So the older adult is going to have more complications simply because as we get older, we're going to have difficulty with things like well, we have to get up and pee a lot more when we're older because our bladder doesn't retain as much fluid because we've lost the elasticity in our bladder. It also can't hold as much. So we have a tendency to go to the bathroom more often. We also have more medical conditions that we're dealing with. So we could have aches and pains that are waking us up in the middle of the night, or we're taking medications to help us sleep that are influencing our ability to stay asleep. So there's a lot of things that will affect us as we get older that impact our ability to sleep. But the biggest factor is that as we get older, we start to produce less melatonin. Melatonin is our natural sleep hormone. It's what helps us fall asleep and stay asleep. So it's a very critical component to have in our system. In some countries, in Europe in particular, there are certain industries where they don't let people over the age of 45 actually work night shifts simply because of the effects on their health status. All right, so we got some issues there. Now, why are we worried about tired truck drivers at all? I mean, shouldn't we just rely on the fact that they can tell when they're tired and when they're going to drift off? Well, there's a lot of questions there to be answered, but I want to show you something from a business case perspective, because if I walk into any organization and I say, look, your employees are tired, we need to do something about it. A lot of times management will throw their hands up and say, well, so what if they're tired? We're all tired. I'm tired. The difference being a person sitting in a desk looking at a computer, his level of tiredness is not going to have the same repercussions as somebody operating an 18-wheeler. So it comes down to risk assessment. But I also want to put this into a business case perspective. So this was a study that was done by Virginia Transportation Tech Institute, and a colleague of mine actually led this research. And they were doing driver simulations and looking at the effects of fatigue on how truck drivers operated their vehicles. And what they found is that the more tired they were, the closer they would drive to the vehicle in front of them, especially if it was another truck. And the reason for that was because it meant that they didn't have to be as aware of everything else around them if they just focused on whatever the driver in front of them was doing, which is not good because you're losing situational awareness. But on top of that, you have to realize that when we're driving tired, we have slower reaction times. So when you're driving closer to somebody, that means there's going to be a lot more hard braking episodes. So those hard braking episodes, what does that translate into? Driving up your fuel costs. In fact, in this study, they found that the fuel was being driven up by about 7%. So we know that fuel costs are a primary concern, if not the main concern, in a lot of trucking industries right now. So when I can equate and say, look, your tired truck drivers are costing you money in fuel, now there seems to be a little bit more buy-in. In terms of obstructive sleep apnea, we know that people who are at high risk for obstructive sleep apnea are males, and particularly those over the age of 50. Now, in research conducted, and again, I'm saying truckers here a lot, and that's just to point out that this wasn't open to all commercial drivers. We're not talking taxi drivers and bus drivers. We're talking strictly truck drivers. This particular research, we saw that OSA positive drivers had a 5-fold greater risk of serious preventable crashes if they were not receiving treatment. So we have a lot of people out there who have OSA or obstructive sleep apnea that aren't receiving treatment. And for those who aren't aware of what obstructive sleep apnea is, it's when you stop breathing while you're trying to sleep for at least 10 seconds at a time. So you're starving both your brain and your heart of oxygen. Here's the thing. Why are they not receiving treatment? Well, because first off, 1 in 4 Canadians have obstructive sleep apnea, but 75% of those who have it have not been diagnosed with it yet. In other words, we've got a lot of tired people out there who know they're tired, but have not gone to get checked out. One of the biggest risk factors, of course, associated with this is if you are a very loud snorer or if you gasp in the middle of the night, that is a major risk factor for suggesting you may have obstructive sleep apnea. On top of that, we know that 29%, this is interesting, this is a study that just came out from Finland, 29% of people who were hospitalized for COVID were also suffering from non-severe obstructive sleep apnea. So not even severe cases, but non-severe obstructive sleep apnea. They found this to be one of the primary risk factors for people who had COVID. And of those who did have OSA and COVID, 1/4 of them actually ended up in ICU. So when they looked at all the other factors that were contributing to people getting COVID, this was, I believe, the second highest link that they saw was people who had obstructive sleep apnea were more likely to develop COVID and more serious forms of COVID. So I just want to show you, a lot of times we talk about, truck driving incidents and risks and everything, but nobody's really actually seen it in real life. So this is what I want to show you right now. I want you to pay attention to the fact that oops, let me go back here. I want you to pay attention to the fact that this guy's eyes, look at his eyes now, they're already closing and they're just very long, deep blinks. We call those microsleeps. And a microsleep, as you can see, is drifting across the center line. Thankfully, there's nobody there. A microsleep can last anywhere from 2 seconds to 30 seconds. But during that time, you don't hear anything, you don't see anything, your sensory perceptions are being shut down. And as you'll notice, his eyes are shutting longer and longer and more frequently. And here we go. Okay, so now the change in the road has abruptly woken him. You think he has control of the vehicle, but his cognitive skills aren't there and he can't control it. So again, that question of, well, why don't we just let the guys self-analyze themselves? Well, the truth of the matter is we will always overestimate our level of alertness and underestimate how tired we are. Why? Because fatigue is an impairment. The front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, shuts down when we're tired. So we cannot judge our own level of impairment. That's why we don't stop the vehicle when we're in that state and just go and have a nap. So we have some organizational challenges. Some of these challenges include things like fatigue being underreported, mostly because employees don't want to tell anybody that they're tired, especially if they're behind the wheel, because they don't want to have any kind of disciplinary action applied to them. So if we have an unjust culture or a blame culture, it's less likely that employees are going to talk about the fact that they're suffering from fatigue or struggling with this on a regular basis. Fatigue is also very hard to detect. I mean, sometimes it's easy when we can see their eyes blinking, but sometimes we don't notice that and they can still have their eyes open, but we're not picking up that they're tired. It's also difficult to measure. It's not like we have a breathalyzer for fatigue. There are other ways that we can measure it, but it can become complex. And fatigue itself and sleep neurobiology is extremely complex. There's nothing simple about fatigue. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's that badge of honor that a lot of us think that, when people say, hey, how you doing? Oh man, I'm tired. I'm working so hard. Well, there's a big difference between working hard and working smart. So our first poll question, I'm going to shift that over to safety driven for a second to pull up the question. Which of these subjects is specifically addressed in your fit for work plan? I'm assuming you have a fit for work or fit for duty plan, and just check all that apply. And if you don't have a fit for duty plan, that's fine too. And the results. Okay, so 80% say yes, drugs and alcohol is part of their fit for work plan. 30% say fatigue impairment is, 75% say physical health or ergonomics is, and mental health 50%. Okay, so it's not surprising to see the drugs and alcohol kind of leading the way, because that was always the initial state for why we even set up a drug and alcohol or a fit for duty plan. So here's what I want you to think about. I'm suggesting that there are four fit for duty pillars, one being drugs and alcohol, one being fatigue impairment, one being physical health, and one being mental health. And the reason I say this is that if we expect an employee to be able to perform to the standard that we want them to perform to, then they have to show up in a state that allows them to do that. And drugs and alcohol, absolutely, that can impair their abilities, as can fatigue, but so can physical health and mental health status. And not only can they individually affect performance, but they feed off of each other. So, for example, if you have an individual who has a sore back, he may be taking medication to alleviate that pain. And now you've got a drug and alcohol problem, even though it's a prescribed medication. Or you could have somebody who's going through a divorce and they're struggling with mental health issues and it's affecting their sleep. Or maybe they're taking alcohol to help them get to sleep, and that's affecting the quality of their sleep. So every one of these feeds off of each other. So we can't just expect that if we have a plan to manage one of these, it's going to take care of performance issues out there. It's not. So we need to expand that fit for duty concept and understand that we need to manage all of these and have something in place. And as we get older, there's going to be more reliance on things like physical health and fatigue in particular. So when we talk about fit for duty, there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that the employee shows up fit to do their job. But we also have to look at the other side of the equation, making sure that the work is designed to fit the worker. And what we're talking about here is a human factors process. Is the job designed to accommodate what we know about the human body and the human capabilities that we have? So here we're talking about things like schedule designs and workloads. All right, poll question number 2, if you could bring that up for me, safety driven. Do you have a fatigue management plan that extends beyond prescriptive rules and schedule management? And results are in. 6% say yes, 94% say no. Okay, well, that tells us a lot right there, doesn't it? Okay, let's talk about what exactly we need to start considering here. So, how is fatigue currently being managed? Well, there are typically three approaches. The first approach you're all familiar with, that's the prescriptive approach. Those are your hours of service regulations, and those are the things that you must do or must accommodate for. But again, they're limited and they're not preventing employees from showing up fatigued. We know that. In fact, we know that 31% of truck drivers who suffer a fatality as the truck driver, 31% of them, the primary factor for that event happening was fatigue. Then the second approach is a strategic approach, which is something I'm encouraging you all to do, you should do. And then third is the tactical approach, which is something that is necessary for you to do. So I'm going to really elaborate on these last two, the strategic approach and the tactical approach. So the strategic approach, what I'm talking about here is having some kind of management system in place. So I have written up here fatigue risk management system. You can change that. It can be safety management system. It can be business management system. You probably already have a safety management system in place. You want your fatigue risk management system to fall inside of that safety management system. You don't have to create a whole brand new one. But the point is, every management system has basically the same elements involved. There's an element that addresses organizational commitment and leadership. There's a planning stage where you develop policies, procedures, establish roles and responsibilities. Then you have an implementation phase. Then you do evaluation of those things that were implemented and any corrective action that needs to be applied. And then you have a management review process, and it's iterative. It feeds off of itself to drive continuous improvement. So the strategic approach is basically your guidance in terms of what the purpose of the program is all about, what that program will look like, how it will be run, and how it will remain viable. This is why most safety programs fail. So the strategic approach was what I was talking about. There's a second role for the strategic approach aside from just supporting roles and responsibilities, policies and procedures. It's also important because we needed to support the tactical approach. The tactical approach is things like training, right? It's where we do the fatigue risk assessment and then we put some controls in place. So what we're talking about here is the recognition of a fatigue risk trajectory. In other words, there are several points along the way before an incident happens that we can say, yes, fatigue was a part of that incident. So I'm going to show you this trajectory and relate it to four different intervention points. So the very first point is sleep opportunity. And what this means is that if you have a schedule that allows employees to work ridiculous hours, or if you have a schedule that just doesn't accommodate for time of day factors such as sleeping during daytime hours, then we're going to expect that employees are going to be struggling to get the sleep that they require. So how likely is an employee to be fatigued due to their work schedule? That's the first thing we have to look at. And if there's some gaps here or some issues here, then we're going to see people showing up tired. So the second level and where we can intervene is are employees getting the sleep that they require? How do we do that? Well, a simple thing is simply to ask them or survey them in some manner, but it means also doing things like offering them training in specific elements of sleep hygiene, but also living a shift work lifestyle. It means knowing what foods to eat that promote alertness and what foods to eat to promote drowsiness when you're getting ready to go to bed. And it can also include things like, are we screening for obstructive sleep apnea or other sleep disorders? Or can we offer a screening checklist or tool to the employee so that they can screen themselves? There's plenty out there that are available. And if anybody wants those, I have those. You can certainly reach out to me and I'd be happy to provide them to you. The third area that we focus on is fatigue related behaviors. So in this situation, if somebody shows up and they are obviously tired and we can see them, maybe they've stopped into the break room, we can see they're rubbing their eyes, they're moving slowly, they're talking slowly, and we know that they still have another 4 hours on shift and they're in a safety sensitive role. What are we doing with that person? How are we identifying whether or not they're fatigued and at what point are they crossing a threshold that we really have to be concerned about? How does the employee identify their fatigue related behaviors? More importantly, what are we doing with that employee when we do identify them? There's all kinds of ways that we can monitor and detect fatigue related behaviors, whether it's there's a lot of technology out there, putting in vehicle cameras. There's actigraphy devices on the wrist. There's PVT testing units. There's all kinds of technology out there. Whether or not you want to go that far down the rabbit hole is another discussion. But then if we have gaps along the way here where we don't have good schedule designs or we've got employees who are showing up tired and we're not doing anything to manage their behavior when they are tired, then what we're going to see are fatigue related errors. And that could be near miss events, that could be close calls. And what are we doing at this point to evaluate those errors when they occur? Are you looking for fatigue related factors? And can we error proof in anticipation of some of these errors? For example, we know that the highest risk time to be driving is between 2 and 6 a.m. What are we doing to manage fatigue under those hours? What kind of error proofing strategies are we putting in place? And then we have, of course, an incident. And when an incident occurs, we can also evaluate that to determine if fatigue was, in fact, a contributing factor to that event. But we have to have the right incident investigation process in place to evaluate for that. So, where do you want to go? What I'm going to show you here is just kind of a sample work plan outline. It's very, very brief. A couple of things I want you to think about. First off, I really encourage you to assess what are your current fatigue risk management efforts. If all you're doing is relying on hours of service regulations, they're insufficient and they're not going to prevent people from showing up tired. And they're certainly not giving you any strategies on what to do when they are tired at the workplace or behind the wheel. The second thing is you might want to develop some kind of guidance document, whether that falls underneath your fit for duty plan or it's a completely separate document. That's for you to decide. But you want to establish the process behind how you're going to manage fatigue. Who's going to be responsible? Are you going to have a fatigue champion? Are you going to have a fatigue risk management team? Are you going to set up roles and responsibilities? Here's what drivers can do, have to do. Here's what supervisors or dispatch has to do. All the roles have to be established. And then you also need to provide some education and training, and not just to the drivers out there. Leadership needs to be educated on the impact of fatigue in the organization. We need a specific structure for supervisors or dispatch. How are they supposed to handle fatigue? What tools are they going to use to identify fatigue or assess a person's fatigue level? And then, of course, the employees, they need strategies, and not just the employees, but their families as well. It's very important to include them in the education and training process because they're very much responsible for providing support to the employee during their off hours. But on top of that, they're the ones maybe that are buying the groceries and giving them the food that they eat and not recognizing the impact on that. And we also know that there's a lot of family breakdown because if the employee can't understand why they're struggling with fatigue and being cranky and irritable and miserable, how can we expect the family to? So we need to incorporate them into that process of education and training. All right, I went through a lot of information very quickly. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'd be more than happy to answer your questions now. And again, I apologize, not sure why we had the disconnect, but we got it back together.